I would just start my presentation.
When you are hungry and malnourished,
daily scheme and one tomorrow on destitution and hunger.
Because you are not keeping the nutrition norm constant.
Now I am sure, ladies and gentlemen, if you scratch your head, you will realize that
what's called a rural reporter.
Now, one of the most distressing developments in this country in the era of neoliberal reforms has been the phenomenal drop in food grains absorption within the population. Now, you have already seen some graphs and figures relating to drop in per capita food grains production. If I look at the year, 3 years ending in 1998, and compare with that the 3 years ending in 2003, then I find that food grains production per head has dropped from 176.8 kilograms per annum to 164 kilograms per annum per capita. Now, this is a drop of about 12.8 kg per head, which is itself quite large. It means that, if you take an average family of 5, in terms of production, something like 60 to 65 kilograms per year less is being produced in this country. But even more serious than that, please don't look at that table yet. I mean, I'm not talking about that at the moment. It's just distracting. I want to set the stage for going to that table by what I'm saying. But even more striking than that is the fact that the food grains availability or absorption, I use the two terms interchangeably, has dropped much more sharply from 174 kilograms per head per annum, again taking the 3 years ending 1997-98, which is barely about 6 years ago, to 153 kilograms, that is 21 kg per head less in the 3-year average ending 2002-03. So that the average family of 5 is actually absorbing more than 100 kilograms less today compared to a mere 6 years ago. Now, all these are there in the table in my paper, but I just want to impress upon you how very, very serious this is, because I think most of our economists have still not woken up to the seriousness of the problem. The fact that the level of food grains absorption we have today in India means that we are back to the average absorption level of the first plan period, 1951-55. That in the last 12-13 years we have lost 40 years of successful efforts to raise our food grains absorption. And I have to make it clear what definitions we are using here. When I talk about food grains availability or absorption, this does not mean simply what people consume directly, as dal, roti, chawal and all that. It includes not only that, but every possible indirect use. It includes all the food grains that is fed to animals and converted to milk, poultry products, livestock products. It includes all the grain which is converted for industrial use, such as industrial alcohol, starch. It includes, in fact, all the processed grain, because we are calculating this from the hardest data we have from the output side. We are not looking at consumption data. We are simply taking the total output. We are adjusting for change in trade and in stocks, and we are dividing through by population. So this is one of the hardest figures we have. So we are today back to the absorption level that we had in the first plan period, and that was also the absorption level we had in the colonial period, the average for the years 1937 to 42. Now, this is a very serious matter because we are down to 153 kilograms per capita per annum now, which is one of the lowest in the world. The only other countries which are lower than us are the sub-Saharan African countries and the least developed countries. Our neighbor China, compared to our absorption of 153 kilograms today, has an absorption of more than 300 kilograms. Mexico's absorption per capita per annum is 375 kilograms. European countries range from 650 to 750 kilograms. And the US, of course, is 850 kilograms or more. So you can see just how low we are. Now the question is, what are the reasons for this loss of food security? Not only the drop in production, but also the drop in absorption, which is highly abnormal. You don't get this kind of a drop normally when an economy has a positive rate of growth of per capita incomes. It never happens, because as countries get better off, they absorb more and more food grains because a higher proportion of it is being converted into higher value, high protein animal products. And that is very grain intensive. So you never get a decline in the per head food grains absorption normally when a country is getting better off in per capita income terms. So my proposition is that the reason we are getting this very abnormal drop in absorption in our country today really has to do with worsening income distribution. Now we know that in urban areas there is no drop. Actually the per diem calorie intake per person has also gone up in urban areas according to the latest data. So the drop is concentrated mainly in the rural areas, and since there is no drop in urban areas, the drop is far larger in the rural areas than the figures I've given to you, which is a very, very serious situation. Now, I would relate this phenomenon to the operation of particular aspects of economic reforms, the new liberal economic reforms that we have been following, combined with trade liberalization. And in order to show you the link between loss of food security for the vast majority of our mainly rural population and the new liberal reforms, I would like you to look at table 1. Can we go back to table 1, please? Now, what is the content of new liberal reforms? This table shows you and summarizes an International Monetary Fund study of 78 countries following fund-guided reforms in the 1980s, because many countries started the reforms long before we did. Now you can see that the main policy package that these countries followed is a deflationary package. First of all, restraint on central government expenditure, 91% of the countries followed this. Secondly, limits on credit expansion, almost all the countries, 99% followed that. Thirdly, reduction in the ratio of budget deficit to GDP, 83% followed it. Fourthly, wage restraint, which means caps on wages. And fifthly, exchange rate policy. Now just the first three policies taken together, implemented together, means a very strongly contractionary deflationary package, which means that governments start cutting their expenditures. And the main head under which they cut expenditures, of course, is development expenditures, investment, and the social sectors. Now the impact of all this has been very well documented in a number of studies. The data I've taken here are from a 2-volume study by Cornea, Jolly, and Stewart, which was sponsored by UNICEF, because people were getting very worried about the very adverse impact on the human development indicators of these kinds of policies. These 2 volumes came out way back in 1987, and they summarized the experience of Latin American and African and those Asian countries which were already following the economic reforms package. Now in India, we started on this rather later. We started only from 1991 in a proper way. But we have also been following exactly the same set of policies. And the third one in particular, all of you will be familiar with, because it keeps getting repeated again and again, reduction in the ratio of budget deficit to GDP. That is something our finance minister and prime minister keep repeating that we must do. And at the moment, it is even legally enshrined in an act, the so-called Fiscal Responsibility and Budgetary Management Act, which sets statutory caps on how much the ratio of budget deficit to GDP should be, which I would rather call the Fiscal Irresponsibility Act. Because when you have no cap on unemployment, when you have no cap on hunger, what business do you have to put a legal cap on how much the government spends on development. You know, this is something that we have to think about. Now, as a result of following contractionary policies, and this was done in a very sharp kind of a way from 1991, for the first time in 30 years, we had negative per capita GDP growth. There was actually fall in per capita GDP in our country. Immediately after Dr. Manmohan Singh as finance minister started these contractionary reforms. Now, I don't have much time, so let me rush on to the next table, which will show you the impact on agriculture. Could we have table 2, please? Of following these contractionary policies. You can see that as part of this, rural development expenditures as percent of net national product was cut very sharply compared to the 7th plan period. That's the first figure, 1985 to 90, under Rajiv Gandhi's prime ministership. Rural development expenditures had been brought up to almost 4% of net national product. And by 2000, 2001, actually that average should come below 85-90. It has got transposed somehow, I'm sorry about that. 85-90 average for those 4 years. You know, there should be no average over the last column. So you can see by 2000, 2001, it had been slashed to exactly half, 1.9% of net national product. And if you add on the infrastructure outlays, you can see that that too has contracted very sharply. So adding up the two, you get a fall from 11% to only 5.8%. Now, when you have this kind of, you know, slashing of rural development expenditures, and here in RDE, I'm including all the central and state government outlays on agriculture and rural development, irrigation and flood control, village and small-scale industry, and special areas programs, right? All the very important heads of expenditure which you can get from any current economic survey. You can see there's been a very large cut. This led to a phenomenal rise in unemployment. First of all, a drop in the rate of growth of agricultural output, because quite apart from cuts in development expenditures, the rate of capital formation in agriculture has also come down. Could we have the next table, please? Table 3. Now, this gives you the decelerating growth rates of agricultural output in relation to population. You can see that both food grains, non-food grains, as well as all crops output growth rates, annual growth rates, were roughly about double, a little less than double in the 1980s compared to the 1990s. So, whereas even though the population growth rate has also come down slightly, it has come down much less than the agricultural growth rates, which means just from seeing this, you know that the per capita output of all crops, of food grains and non-food grains has been declining in the 1990s for the first time again since the mid-60s agricultural crisis. Can we have the next table, please? Table 4. Now, the very fact of decline in growth rates in output mean that automatically you will have decline in employment as long as the labor coefficients are unchanged, that is the labor days per unit of output. If they are unchanged, then if the output growth rate becomes half, the growth rate of employment in agriculture will also become half. But actually the growth rate of employment has fallen much more than the output growth rate has. We have had a real collapse of the rate of employment growth. You can see that the workforce growth rate in the period, it has all got a bit transposed, the headings. This tends to happen sometimes. Look at the last two columns. The workforce growth rate, 2.4%, relates not to the period 1983 to 1993. Now that decelerates to only 0.7%. So it has become less than a third from 1993 to 1999-2000. Okay, a virtual collapse of employment, and the only thing which is growing fast, which is the last row, the last figure, growing very fast, is unemployment, which is growing at 5.3% per annum in rural areas. Now, all these are related. You can't talk about rising unemployment without talking about the falling growth rates, and you can't talk about falling growth rates without the contractionary policies, the reduction in development spending. And only if you have a correct analysis of why we have this problem of unemployment, growing unemployment, and falling rates of output growth, can we have a correct solution to the problem. If we don't have a correct analysis, then the solutions we will put forward will also be incorrect, and they're likely to worsen the situation further. Now, the growth of unemployment, the loss of days worked, not only of open unemployment, but the number of days worked by agricultural laborers, by farmers, has dropped very dramatically, means, of course, a drop in purchasing power in rural areas. And the drop in purchasing power is the major factor behind the drop in food grains absorption. And here I would like to disagree very strongly and emphatically with the view which is put forward in our official government publications. For example, in the Reserve Bank of India's report on currency and finance, or in the Finance Ministry's economic survey, you will find an analysis of falling food grains availability, absorption, which in my view is completely fallacious and incorrect, because what is being said there is that people are voluntarily reducing their cereals intake. They are voluntarily diversifying their diets away from the food grains towards the higher value crops, and people say this is part of the operation of the so-called Engels law. Now, Engels law was formulated in the context of advanced countries for populations who already start from a fairly high level of income, and you observe that as their income rises, they do tend to substitute direct consumption of grain as bread and so on by more and more consumption of meat, of animal products. So you can see that, the American lifestyle, it's very clear what is happening there. But in our country, we have an absolute decline in food grains absorption, which is not owing to any voluntary diversification at all. It is owing to loss of purchasing power. And the crucial index is that the energy intake per consumer in rural India is dropping sharply. This is no Engels law. This is not the normal Engels law, which you get in the advanced countries at all. This is actually distress diversification, if you like, where people cannot afford to buy the basic staples which give the major part of the energy for our poor populations, and they're forced to cut down on their basic food intake. And as I've said, a consequence has been that we are today have the dubious distinction of being only just above the sub-Saharan African countries. As a matter of fact, roughly about half of the rural population of India is already at the average intake level of the 46 sub-Saharan African countries taken together, and the situation is worsening fast. The other major reason why we have had such a phenomenal drop in purchasing power in rural India is that, unfortunately, we opened up our agricultural economy at the wrong time. We did away with restrictions on agricultural trade, and in compliance with the World Trade Organization requirements, we exposed our farmers to global competition at a time from 1997 onwards in particular, when global markets, advanced country markets, had gone into recession, and when global prices of crops were falling steeply. And I forget which table I had there. Can we go to the next table where I show some fall in prices? Can we have table? Ah, yes, this is the table. These are the prices of some important traded primary products. And you can see it is not just the tropical crops, but also wheat, rice, maize, etc., everything. If you compare 2001 with 1995, that's the last column, you find that the unit dollar price has dropped. The drop ranges from 34% in the case of US varieties of rice to 88% for palm oil. That means a given amount of palm oil has only 12% of the value by 2001 that it had way back in 1995. Now, in the case of many crops in our own country, like tea, coffee, pepper, spices, etc., The fall started a little later in 1998, and it is continuing to this date. The price of coffee to the grower is only a quarter by 2003 compared to 1998. Price of tea to the grower only 1/3. Same with pepper. That is why in a single district of Kerala, Wayanad district, there have been almost 1,300 farmer suicides in the last 5 years alone. Just one district of Kerala, which has been perhaps most affected by these crashing prices. Now, it is not the case that in the past we never had global prices crashing. The same thing happened in the 1980s. You know, global prices went down between 1981 and 86, almost to the same extent. But the Indian farmer was not affected by it because Indian agriculture was then not open to world trade, it was not trade liberalized. So he didn't care what was happening to global prices. All he had to worry about is whether the state marketing board was going to give him the same price as it had done last year. So you can't blame it on global prices either. You have to blame what is happening, this phenomenal drop in output prices, which has affected our farmers producing export crops. You have to blame it on the fact that we liberalized our trade precisely at the wrong time. And this has also contributed to drop of purchasing power and of course led to phenomenal distress. In the case of cotton production, you can see cotton is there, one of the crops there, about halfway down the table. Between 1995 and 2001, cotton price dropped to 1/2 of what it was. And precisely during the same period, under the advice of the World Bank, particularly in Andhra Pradesh, also elsewhere, but especially in Andhra Pradesh, because Andhra Pradesh had taken a structural adjustment loan, state level loan from the World Bank, the power tariff was hiked 5 times. You also had financial sector reforms, you had banking sector reforms, under which agriculture and small-scale industry were no longer considered priority sectors for lending, and therefore they no longer got loans from the banking system at a lower rate of interest. So farmers were driven into the arms of private money lenders. I have gone to villages in Andhra Pradesh. The rate of interest charged by the private money lender is 3 rupees to 5 rupees per 100 rupees per month. So the annual rate of interest varies from 36% to 60%. And if you don't manage to pay off, then of course the interest also is compounded. So the actual amount that is charged is even higher. So our farmers have been faced with an income squeeze of an unprecedented dimension. In fact, in one of my papers I have pointed out that the situation today is as bad and in some respects even worse than the Great Depression years of the late 1920s when there was an agricultural crisis. Farmers are sinking deeper and deeper into debt, and there is no way out, because if I look at global projections made by the international bodies like the Food and Agriculture Organization, by UNCTAD and so on, which deal with international trade in primary commodities, they are all projecting continuing fall in terms of trade in real prices of primary products. The projection is continuing fall up to at least 2009-10. So there is absolutely no solace in trying to access external markets, and I simply do not understand how any economist, including Dr. Manmohan Singh, can say that we should go in for agricultural diversification, produce for export, we should invite the transnational corporations in. The TNCs are also operating within this milieu of falling global prices, so the only way they will get their profit, which they've already started doing in the case of tea and coffee and so on. The Indian grower is feeling the pinch. The only way they will maintain their profit is to grind the grower down, the actual producer down, to lower and lower and lower levels, to give him less and less and less. A quarter of the price the coffee grower was getting only 5 years ago, he's getting today. So what do you expect him to do except commit suicide? There have been more than 9,000 recorded farmer suicides in our country since 1998. Something like more than 5,000 of them are in Andhra Pradesh, but there are new centers which are coming up all the time of crisis, in Karnataka, in Vidarbha, and the latest one, as I mentioned, is of course in Kerala. And the Punjab and Haryana farmers are not exempt from this either because of the fall in domestic absorption of food grains. It used to be the surplus production of the Punjab and Haryana farmer, which was procured by the food corporation. So they had an internal market. This fall in domestic absorption has meant, I made a quick calculation, that they have lost an internal market to the tune of 26 million tons of food grains. In the sense that if the per capita absorption in the country had been maintained at the same level today as in 1991, then the internal demand for food grains would have been 26 million tons higher than it actually is. So is it surprising that the most prosperous agricultural states are also in a state of crisis? They are being asked to diversify and export, but export where? When unit dollar prices are slated to fall further. So this is the order of the crisis that our farmers are involved in, and I regret to say that very few people have become aware of the really severe dimensions of this crisis. Too many people are fooling themselves with what I characterize in this paper, which has been circulated to you, as fairy tales, bedtime fairy tales, which are fit only for intellectual infants, by saying that there is voluntary reduction. How do you have voluntary reduction when there is rising unemployment, when there is falling calorie intake, when there is phenomenal agrarian distress, when there are more than 9,000 farmer suicides, which is only the tip of the iceberg, when there is deepening indebtedness, when there is loss of assets, because farmers don't reduce their consumption, or laborers don't immediately reduce their consumption. What they do is they try to maintain the already meager consumption they have by parting with a little bit of asset at a time. Movable assets. Farmers will try to sell land if they can't meet their consumption needs. So when the calorie intake level is shown to be going down, then you really hit rock bottom. It means that a lot of people have lost whatever transferable assets they have, and they have no other alternative but to go hungrier and hungrier. So the agrarian crisis, in my view, was the main reason for the resounding defeat of the NDA government in last year's general elections. Because the NDA government not only did not realize what was happening, it made things worse. Many of us were saying that, look, the reason that all these huge food stocks are building up, 63 million tons of food grain stocks by July 2002, almost 40 million tons in excess of the buffer norms for that time of year. What should you do with it? We were saying, look, these 60 million tons are not the result of any voluntary reduction. It is a result of falling purchasing power. So what you have to do is to give back purchasing power to people who are getting impoverished. You have to put some food in their stomachs. Start food for work on a more and more massive scale. The only place food for work was done was in Rajasthan to some extent because of the drought conditions. And what I'm saying here is that we are completely fixated only on drought. We don't understand that even without drought, you can have a very serious situation arising when purchasing power declines. The food grains are there, but people can't afford to buy it. So what you need to do then, or in Keynesian terms, you have a phenomenal drop in effective demand. So you have to restore the demand. The only way you can do it is to provide employment, which is why the recently passed National Rural Employment Guarantee Act is so important. But it's only the first stage, because then we have to see that those who control the nation's finances don't try to say that we don't have the resources. The resources are there. We have to see that it gets implemented, because that's the only way in which the very dismal scenario that I've been giving you, that can be actually reversed. Now, I don't think I have much time. I've already taken quite a lot. I'll just take a few moments more to go quickly through the other. Table 6, please. Yes, well, this I won't dwell on. I've already mentioned the build-up of stocks. Next one, please. Table 7. So this gives you the data that I started my talk with, which is the phenomenal fall, the one in bold, in the availability per head of food grains. You just look at 1997, the middle years, 174 kilograms down to 153 kilograms by 2002-03. Next, please. Now, these are just the charts which are illustrating the same thing. The dark blue one line on top is the output, which is going down in the 1990s. The pink one is the absorption, which is going down even faster, all right, because of the drop in purchasing power. So that gap between the two is what it came up as food grain stocks, as huge food grain stocks, because the PDS offtake went down from 20 million tons in 1991 to virtually half of that, to 10 point something million tons by 2001. So that's why the stocks built up. Next, please. And that is the long-term trend. I started my talk by telling you that the availability per capita we have today is the same as what we had in the period 1937 to 42, which overlaps with the Second War. Of course, it got worse since then. Right in the middle of the graph, you can see it dipped by 1945-46. It had dipped to 136 kilograms. And then after independence, we slowly started raising it, and we raised it to around 178 kilograms by the beginning of the 1990s, and today it is back to the level of 1937 to 42. Since I have taught economic history for 30 years, these are very well documented data on the long-term trends in availability and output in our country, which anybody can check up. Next, please. Now, what the NDA government actually did with these huge food stocks, instead of doing food for work on a massive scale and putting some food into the stomachs of people who are going more and more hungry, it exported out of stocks at less than BPL price. And we have never had such enormous exports ever in the history of independent India. Over the years 2002 and 2003, and you remember Kharif 2002 was a very bad drought year. Food grains output had fallen by 30 million tons. Over these 2 years, 22 million tons of food grains were exported by the NDA government. And I believe most of these exports were used as animal feed in the importing countries. That is, it was used for feeding European cattle and Japanese pigs. So you can understand why some of us are very angry that your own population is going hungry and you prefer to feed foreign animals. And perhaps it is also understandable why the rural electorate gave such a drubbing to the government which had allowed this to happen. So we have to see today that genuine measures are taken to restore purchasing power, which has been lost owing to wrong policies. And of course, the major steps in this direction are to implement the rural employment guarantee sincerely, and also I would say to abolish the artificial division between the above poverty line and below poverty line population. Because the second part of my paper deals with the government's estimates of poverty, the Planning Commission estimates of poverty. Can we go to the next table, please? Now, this gives you the National Sample Survey data, using which the Planning Commission and a number of individual economists estimate poverty in our country. Now, the definition of poverty is that per capita monthly expenditure on all goods and services whose food expenditure part allows a person to access 2,400 calories in rural India and 2,100 calories in urban India. These data relate to rural India alone. I have highlighted the expenditure which was required in 99-2000 to get 2,400 calories in rural India. You can see the second column gives you the calorie intake per diem per capita. 2403 is the average for the expenditure class, 525 to 615 rupees. And if you plot the data, you find a person needed to spend 570 rupees per month in order to access that. What is the Planning Commission poverty line for the same year using the same data? 328 rupees. That is how it got a poverty percentage. Look at the last column. 328 will give you, if you plot the data, 27% in poverty. But what the Planning Commission has not told us, what the government does not tell us, what the individual economists don't tell us, is that at that poverty line expenditure, a person in village India could access 1,870 calories only, not 2,400. So what you're doing is, you're getting low and declining poverty percentages which are spurious because you are not keeping the nutrition norm constant. Now, I can make poverty disappear from this country completely, statistically, if I choose to lower the nutrition norm. And on the basis of the 16th round data, I only hope the Planning Commission will not be misguided enough to tell us that rural poverty has declined to below 20%, because that is what will happen if we use their procedure. The Planning Commission procedure is not to look at the current data at all. Its procedure is to take a more than 30-year-old poverty line relating to 1973-74. In that year, the rural poverty line was 49 rupees monthly per capita expenditure, 49 rupees in 1973-74. And all it does, it ignores all the current data and it applies a price index to update that. And that's how it gets at 328 rupees. Now, I have been critiquing the official Planning Commission poverty estimates, and I intend to do it because this is not an academically valid procedure. You cannot lower the consumption standard and then say poverty is declining. No, that is not acceptable. And you have to inform the public what you're doing. There is no transparency in the method of estimation. The actual extent of rural poverty in 99-2000 is given by that bold line. Please go all the way to the last column. 69.7% of persons in rural India were below the average expenditure, which would allow them to access 2403. And even in that group, some people are below, so if you plot the data, what you get is 74.5%. That is the correct estimate of poverty in rural India. 74.5%, not 27% for that year. And so it doesn't make any sense to divide the population into above and below poverty line and to deny BPL ration cards to those who are not officially poor, because the officially poor are very small. The actually poor are very large compared to the officially poor. Thank you very much for your attention.